Everyone thinks they understand what's happening right now. They think this is just another chapter in the long, loud, exhausting Trump saga. Another round of insults, another round of outrage, another cycle that will blow over like all the others. And if you feel a little confused about why this moment feels different, or why the reaction abroad suddenly seems sharper, colder, and more serious than before, you're not wrong. In fact, that confusion is the clue. Because beneath the noise, something much bigger is shifting, and almost no one is explaining it clearly. What's unfolding isn't just about Donald Trump. It's about how the world now sees America, and why that perception may be changing faster than Washington realizes. For decades, the United States benefited from an assumption so deeply embedded it barely needed defending. Even when America made mistakes, even when its leaders stumbled or lied or overreached, there was still a belief that the country ultimately anchored the global order. Allies complained, rivals protested, critics marched, but the underlying structure held. The US was the hub, the dollar was the center, the security umbrella mattered, and crucially, American presidents, regardless of party, understood that leadership came with constraints. You didn't just say whatever felt good to a domestic crowd if it shattered trust abroad. You managed appearances because appearances were power. Trump never accepted that bargain. From the moment he entered politics, he treated alliances like bad business deals, diplomacy like weakness, and reputation as something you could bully into submission. For his supporters, that bluntness felt refreshing. For foreign leaders, it felt like a warning flare. At first, many of them assumed it was an act or a temporary detour. They waited him out. They told themselves the institutions would restrain him, that the professionals would smooth the edges, that America would snap back to normal once the fever broke. That assumption held for a while. It doesn't anymore. What's different now is not just Trump's rhetoric, but the context in which it's landing. The world is already more fragmented, more transactional, and less forgiving than it was in 2016. Power is diffusing. China is more assertive. Russia has shown it's willing to burn norms to the ground. Middle powers are hedging instead of choosing sides. In that environment, credibility is everything, and credibility, once lost, is brutally hard to rebuild. When Trump lashes out at allies, flirts with abandoning security commitments, or frames global politics as a zero-sum grudge match, it doesn't just generate headlines. It forces other countries to plan for a future where America might not show up. This is where the panic starts to creep in. Not the cable news version of panic, but the quieter, more dangerous kind that happens in briefing rooms and foreign ministries. You can hear it in the language diplomats use now far more openly than before. European leaders talk about strategic autonomy, not as a theoretical goal, but as an insurance policy. Asian allies quietly expand defense ties with each other instead of relying solely on Washington. Even countries long accustomed to US leadership are exploring alternatives, not because they want to abandon America, but because they're no longer sure America won't abandon them first. Trump, for his part, seems dimly aware of this shift, and that awareness shows up in his behavior. The louder he insists that other countries need the US more than the US needs them, the more it sounds like someone trying to convince himself. His attacks on NATO, his fixation on trade deficits, his framing of diplomacy as humiliation rather than leverage, all reflect a worldview stuck in a past where American dominance was automatic. But dominance isn't automatic anymore. It has to be maintained, signaled, and reinforced. And when those signals turn erratic, the market adjusts. The irony is that much of Trump's base believes this posture makes America stronger. They hear America first and imagine leverage, fear, respect. What they don't see is how often it produces the opposite effect. Fear can motivate compliance in the short term, but it accelerates exit strategies in the long term. Respect comes from reliability, not volume. When countries start asking themselves whether US guarantees depend on who's holding a rally that week, they don't complain publicly. They quietly prepare to live without them. This is the deeper story most coverage misses. It's not that Trump is uniquely offensive, or that foreign leaders are suddenly thin-skinned. It's that the old assumption that America would always be the stable center of gravity no longer feels safe. And once that assumption cracks, everything else starts to wobble. Trade, security, influence, even culture all rest on that foundation. Trump didn't create this vulnerability by himself, but he's exposing it, accelerating it, and in some ways exploiting it for domestic applause. As this backlash grows, the question isn't whether Trump notices it. The question is whether the American political system understands what's at stake and whether it still knows how to respond before the shift becomes permanent. Because once the world starts moving on, it rarely comes back the same way. If part one was about the fracture, this next layer is about the consequences people don't see because they happen quietly behind closed doors long before they show up in headlines. Power rarely disappears overnight. It erodes. And what's unnerving a lot of foreign governments right now isn't just what Trump says, but how predictable the pattern has become. They're learning how to read the incentives driving him. And once you understand those incentives, the anxiety makes sense. Trump approaches global politics the way he approaches everything else, as a performance aimed at a specific audience. Not the world, not history, not long-term strategy, but his domestic base and his own sense of dominance. Every confrontation is framed as strength. Every compromise is framed as surrender. That framing plays well on television, but it breaks something essential in diplomacy. Diplomacy only works when both sides believe the other is capable of restraint. When restraint disappears, so does trust. Take alliances. For most of the post-World War II era, American alliances weren't just about military force. They were about predictability. Countries aligned with the US not because America was perfect, but because it was legible. You knew what Washington cared about, what lines it wouldn't cross, and what commitments it would honor, even when it was inconvenient. Trump turned that logic upside down. He openly questioned whether US security guarantees were conditional on payment, loyalty, or personal admiration. That may sound like tough bargaining, but to allies it sounded like a warning that treaties had become optional. Once that idea enters the bloodstream, it changes behavior fast. Governments don't wait around to be humiliated publicly or abandoned strategically. They hedge, they diversify. They start asking uncomfortable questions about whether relying on the US is a risk rather than an asset. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Those decisions don't reverse easily. You don't rebuild an independent defense capability or alternative trade network just to throw it away later because Washington feels more normal again. Trump's defenders often argue that this is exactly the point, that fear and uncertainty force other countries to respect America. But respect born of fear is brittle. It works until it doesn't. The moment another option looks safer, countries take it. We're seeing that play out in real time, especially in Europe. The push for independent defense structures isn't driven by anti-American sentiment. It's driven by risk management. Leaders there have to answer a simple question from their voters. What happens if the US elects someone who treats alliances like a reality show? The media tends to frame this as a personality clash. Trump versus foreign elites. But that misses the structural shift entirely. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about planning horizons. Governments think in decades. When they see a major power whose foreign policy swings wildly based on domestic grievance politics, they adjust accordingly. That adjustment looks calm on the surface, but it's deeply consequential underneath. And Trump feels this slipping control, even if he can't articulate it. That's why his rhetoric has grown more confrontational, more absolutist. He doesn't just argue that America is strong. He insists that other countries are desperate, dependent, irrelevant without US approval. That insistence isn't confidence, it's insecurity. When power is unquestioned, it doesn't need to be shouted. There's also a financial dimension that rarely breaks through the noise. Global confidence in American leadership supports everything from the dollar's dominance to the willingness of other countries to absorb US economic shocks. When that confidence weakens, the costs don't show up immediately, but they accumulate. Trade partners become less forgiving. Financial systems explore alternatives. The idea that America can unilaterally dictate terms starts to look outdated. What makes this moment especially volatile is that Trump isn't operating in a vacuum. He's amplifying trends that were already there. Populism, nationalism, and distrust of institutions didn't begin with him, but he's channeling them into a foreign policy style that treats volatility as strength. Abroad, volatility is interpreted very differently. It's read as unreliability, and unreliability is the one thing allies and adversaries agree they can't afford. So when you hear foreign leaders speaking more openly about contingency plans or see new partnerships forming without US involvement, that's not a tantrum, it's a calculation. And once those calculations are made, the leverage Trump believes he's asserting starts to evaporate. Because leverage only works if the other side believes you'll still be there tomorrow, and increasingly, they're not sure. By the time we get to this stage of the story, the question isn't whether the world is reacting to Trump, it's how deeply those reactions are reshaping the system he assumes he still controls. One of the most revealing things about this moment is how often Trump talks about loyalty. He demands it from allies the way he demands it from aides, as if international politics operates on personal allegiance rather than shared interests. That misunderstanding is at the core of why the backlash has intensified and why it's no longer confined to traditional critics. Countries don't form alliances out of affection. They do it because the arrangement advances their security, prosperity, or survival. The US-led order worked not because everyone loved America, but because it offered stability at a scale no alternative could match. Trump's approach treats that system as if it were an act of charity America can withdraw from at will. From the outside, that looks less like strength and more like a threat to the entire architecture that kept conflict contained for generations. This is where other powers see opportunity. When US leadership looks erratic, competitors don't rush in with tanks. They move with contracts, infrastructure, and influence. China, in particular, has been methodical about this. While Trump rails against globalization in abstract terms, Beijing offers concrete deals: ports, rail lines, trade access, technology partnerships. These aren't always good deals, and many countries are wary of the strings attached. But when the alternative feels unpredictable, even flawed options become attractive. What's striking is how often Trump's own actions validate the concerns of those countries. When he publicly berates allied leaders, withdraws from agreements without replacement strategies, or frames global cooperation as a scam, it reinforces the narrative that America is inward-looking and transactional. That narrative doesn't have to be completely true to be powerful. It just has to be plausible enough for policymakers to justify hedging their bets. At home, this dynamic is almost invisible. Domestic politics absorbs all the oxygen. Every statement is filtered through the culture war. Every foreign reaction is dismissed as jealousy or manipulation. But abroad, people aren't arguing about Trump as a personality. They're asking whether the US political system still produces continuity, and the answer looks increasingly uncertain. If foreign policy can swing this dramatically from one election to the next, then long-term alignment becomes risky. Trump seems to sense this loss of gravitational pull, and his response has been to double down on dominance narratives. He talks about respect constantly, but respect in his framework means obedience. That's not how influence works in a multipolar world. Influence comes from shaping incentives, not issuing ultimatums. When ultimatums fail, as they often do, the issuer looks weaker, not stronger. The media framing often obscures this by treating each flare-up as a standalone scandal. A harsh comment here, a threatened withdrawal there. But the accumulation matters. Over time, those moments create a picture of a country that might turn its back without warning. And once that picture sets in, even attempts at reassurance are viewed skeptically. Promises start sounding temporary. There is also a generational aspect that rarely gets discussed. Younger leaders and diplomats didn't grow up with the same post-Cold War assumptions. They're less emotionally attached to American leadership and more pragmatic about alternatives. When they hear Trump talk about the world owing America something, it doesn't resonate. It sounds like nostalgia for a hierarchy that no longer exists. This is the point where Trump's panic becomes visible, not in overt admissions, but in the way he frames every international development as a personal slight or betrayal. He reacts not like a confident leader presiding over a stable system, but like someone watching a market turn against him. And markets, once they turn, don't respond to bluster. They respond to fundamentals. The fundamental shift here is that American leadership is no longer assumed. It has to be chosen. And the more Trump treats that choice as an entitlement, the more other countries question whether making it is still in their interest. By this point, the consequences aren't hypothetical anymore. They're showing up in how institutions behave, how deals get structured, and how much patience the world has left for American volatility. What's remarkable is how often this shift gets misread inside the US as hostility, when in reality it's closer to resignation. Countries aren't lashing out at America because of Trump. They're adjusting to an America that might not reliably lead. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Institutions are a good place to see this clearly. Multilateral organizations were never perfect, but they functioned on the assumption that the US would anchor them, fund them, and occasionally restrain itself for the sake of stability. Trump treated many of these institutions as enemies rather than tools. He attacked them publicly, withheld support, and questioned their legitimacy whenever they constrained him. The message was unmistakable. America's participation was conditional and its commitment shallow. The response wasn't dramatic walkouts or public condemnations. It was something far more consequential. Other countries began planning around the US rather than with it. They explored parallel forums, alternative mechanisms, and informal coalitions that could function even if Washington disengaged. These moves didn't make headlines because they weren't confrontational. They were pragmatic, and pragmatism is how power actually shifts. Trump often frames this as proof that America has been exploited, that the world panics whenever the US threatens to pull back. But what he mistakes for panic is actually adaptation. When a system becomes unreliable, rational actors redesign it. That's not defiance, it's survival. And the redesigned system rarely puts the unreliable actor back at the center. This is where the idea that America is losing the world stops sounding like hyperbole and starts sounding descriptive. Losing the world doesn't mean allies suddenly become enemies or flags get burned in the streets. It means phone calls don't get returned as quickly. It means proposals are met with polite skepticism. It means influence that once felt automatic now requires persuasion. And persuasion is a skill Trump has never valued. Inside Trump's inner circle, this shows up as frustration and grievance. Advisors complain that other countries aren't showing enough gratitude, aren't falling in line, aren't acknowledging American power. But gratitude isn't a currency in geopolitics. Credibility is. And credibility is built slowly and lost fast. Every time Trump signals that commitments are disposable, he erodes the very leverage he claims to be protecting. There's also a psychological shift underway that's harder to measure but impossible to ignore. For generations, aligning with the US carried a certain prestige. It signaled modernity, security, and access. That prestige isn't gone, but it's no longer unquestioned. When American leadership looks chaotic, moral authority weakens alongside strategic authority. Other countries feel less pressure to justify divergence. They stop asking for permission. Trump's reaction to this has been telling. Rather than adapting, he escalates. He frames cooperation as weakness and compromise as betrayal. That plays well in a domestic environment where toughness is performative. Internationally, it reads as inflexibility. And inflexibility in a changing system is a liability, not a strength. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that these changes don't trigger alarms at home. There's no single vote, no treaty collapse, no dramatic break, just a gradual reorientation of the world away from automatic American leadership. Trump didn't invent that trajectory, but he's accelerating it, often unknowingly. And once the center of gravity shifts, shouting at it won't pull it back. By the time leaders fully acknowledge what's been lost, rebuilding it will be far harder than preserving it ever was. This is where everything comes together, because the final question isn't really about Trump at all. It's about whether the damage being done is reversible and whether the American system still understands how power actually works in a world that no longer waits. Trump's panic, when you strip away the theatrics, comes from sensing that the old shortcuts don't work anymore. You can't demand leadership, you can't threaten your way into trust, and you can't rebuild credibility by insisting it never mattered in the first place. For much of American history, the country benefited from momentum. Even bad decisions were cushioned by goodwill built up over decades. Allies complained, but they stayed. Institutions bent, but they held. That buffer is thinner now, not because America suddenly became weak, but because the world became more flexible. More options exist. More pathways around US leadership are viable. And once those pathways are built, they don't disappear just because Washington changes its tone. Trump's instinct is to deny this reality. He frames every loss of influence as fake news, every act of independence by allies as disloyalty, every criticism as proof that America must be doing something right. That worldview is emotionally satisfying, but strategically hollow. It mistakes noise for leverage and anger for authority, and it leaves the US reacting to shifts it used to shape. What's most striking is how avoidable much of this was. Maintaining leadership doesn't require submission or nostalgia. It requires consistency, humility, and an understanding that power today is as much about coordination as coercion. The tragedy of Trump's approach is that it burns trust faster than it builds alternatives. It leaves behind a vacuum that others are more than happy to fill, not because they're stronger, but because they're steadier. The global backlash Trump faces isn't a coordinated rebellion, it's a collective shrug, a realization that waiting for America to stabilize may be riskier than preparing for a future where it doesn't. That realization doesn't come with speeches or declarations. It comes with quiet investments, new partnerships, and contingency plans that assume US unpredictability is a permanent feature, not a temporary glitch. And this is where the story turns back inward, because the real cost of losing the world isn't humiliation abroad, it's constraint at home. When America's word carries less weight, everything becomes harder. Negotiations take longer, crises escalate faster, influence costs more to deploy and delivers less in return. Power doesn't vanish, but it becomes inefficient. Trump treats this as an insult to be fought rather than a warning to be heeded. In doing so, he reveals the central contradiction of his politics. He wants the benefits of global leadership without accepting the responsibilities that make it possible. He wants admiration without accountability, dominance without durability. And the world, having adjusted once, is unlikely to be fooled again. The uncomfortable truth is that America's position in the world was never guaranteed. It was maintained through choices, norms, and relationships that required constant care. Trump's era has exposed how fragile those foundations can be when treated as props instead of pillars. Whether the US can rebuild what's been weakened depends on whether it learns the right lesson, not from Trump's rhetoric, but from the world's response to it. Because the world isn't waiting, it's moving. And history tends to reward those who understand change early, not those who shout at it the loudest.